Today, we're comparing a $300 guitar, the Ibanez RG421EX, which specifically costs 358 euros on Thomann right now, and a $1,000 guitar. In this case, my limited edition Fender Vintera Strat 60s, which cost me about $1,000. I've reviewed both these guitars on the channel individually, and you can go back and watch those videos if you want my full opinions on both of them. I'll leave links in the description to both those videos. Now, of course, these guitars are completely different, almost opposites, if you will, but that's part of the reason why I have them both. They complement each other really well and give me a lot of variety. And although these are very different in multiple aspects, I want to do a comparison between these two from a strictly monetary perspective. I want to tell you what the $1,000 guitar can do that the 300 can't, and if the difference is worth it. Hopefully this video will help some of you decide if the extra money is worth it for where you are or not. This video will be broken down into a few parts. First we'll look at build quality, then playability, and finally sound. And I'll try to give you my impressions of how these two price points rank against each other on these categories. And finally, we'll try to identify which price bracket you should go for, depending on your personal needs. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. I'm currently at 710 subscribers, but can we get to 1,000? With your help, I'm sure we can. So please hit that subscribe button. It would be super helpful. All right, back to the video. Let's start with build quality. There are some big differences to mention here. The Fender guitar is very obviously much better built than the Ibanez. That's obvious by just looking at them in front of you. The finish of the Fender is very high quality. The fingerboard is clean with its impeccable rosewood board and white dots, and the quality of the woods is instantly visible when you look at the neck, for example, which in this case is a beautiful roasted maple. The build on this Fender is very good, and this has been one of the things that surprised me the most about this Mexican Fender. It looks 90% as good as any USA-made Fender, at least on the surface. This is not the case for the Ibanez at all. One of the critiques I've made about the RG421EX is the extremely poor build quality from the Indonesian factory on this model. The fingerboard and the binding around it are very rough, they look unfinished, and the wood on the fretboard is clearly of much lower quality than the rosewood used on the Fender. That's plain to see and is also felt when you play both of them. The Fender is smooth as a whistle, while the Ibanez is quite rough. This is specifically noticeable when you do bends and when fretting chords. When playing melody or riffs, the Ibanez does just fine on this aspect. So in the category of build quality, I think the difference between spending $300 or spending $1,000 is really noticeable. For $1,000, you start getting into the diminishing returns category very solidly. I've owned much more expensive guitars, and I can assure you that the difference between this Fender and the $4,000 Tom Anderson is not that significant. Of course, a Tom Anderson guitar is a much better instrument in all senses of the word, but in terms of construction and materials, the Tom Anderson is not objectively 4 times better than the Fender. It's much better built, yes, but not 4 times better built. While in the case of the Ibanez versus the Fender, the difference in build quality is gigantic, to the point where the Ibanez feels and looks like a beginner instrument, while the Fender feels like a professional guitar. In my view, if you want to get the absolute best build quality you can for the lowest price, I think $1,000 is the sweet spot right now. Guitars more expensive than that aren't that much better in terms of build, as the price would indicate, but guitars below are far worse. And a quick note about the Ibanez in the $300 price point. I've had experience with other instruments in this price bracket, including my Sire bass, which cost around $400 and was also built at the Chord factory, and the build on that bass is exponentially better than the Ibanez. So again, the poor build quality is not exactly about the price point, but more of an Ibanez problem in my view. There's other brands out there like Sire, which can and do build great instruments for around $300, to where the difference between that and a $1,000 guitar would not be as noticeable as it is here. Regarding the playability of these guitars, things get way more balanced. Both of these guitars perform great in this category. I would go so far as to say that there's really not a big difference between them other than aspects determined by the build quality, like the fact that bending feels smoother on the Fender. Other than that, there's not a lot of differences here. And don't get me wrong, the playability on these two couldn't be more different. The Fender is a vintage spec Strat, while the Ibanez is a super modern shred monster, so there's a ton of aesthetical and technical differences, but if we look at them in their respective tiers, they both perform great. The Fender has a slightly thicker neck than the Ibanez, being a 60s inspired guitar, but it's still pretty thin for most people and is very usable for faster music and even some shredding. Maybe not the most technical stuff like 8-finger tapping or something, because the fingerboard is a vintage 725 radius and legato is not as easy, but I personally feel very capable of playing anything on the Fender. Of course, sound-wise, the single coils will have their limitations, but that's just the name of the game. The Ibanez, being over 3 times cheaper than the Fender, also plays really well. I would say that chord-heavy stuff like neo-soul riffs, for example, are quite a bit easier on the Fender as expected, but heavy shredding is easier on the Ibanez due to its flatter fingerboard and thinner neck. So, just as expected. I can't say without a doubt that the Fender plays better than the Ibanez. I think they both play really well and both play better than I would expect either guitar to play in their price points. I'm honestly unsure if my more expensive guitars that I used to own played any better than these two. I'm convinced they didn't. They were of course nicer in other aspects, but I don't think playability was one of them. I think it's really good news that companies building cheaper instruments are putting in the time to make them play well as a priority, because instruments that play terribly have been a nightmare for many beginner guitarists who ended up giving up on the guitar entirely because of a bad guitar. I was lucky enough that my first guitar over 15 years ago was an Ibanez Geo, which was notoriously easy to play. And now, sound. Despite being very different, these two guitars are on extremely different levels of quality. I've owned guitars with humbuckers and single coils at pretty much every price point on the market, and it's very obvious to me that good guitar tone requires good pickups, obviously. But let me make a clarification. I've owned tremendously expensive guitars that didn't sound any good. Such was the case with the Suhr Classic S, which I had to sell a month after buying it because I absolutely hated the way it sounded. And I've also owned very inexpensive stuff that sounds brilliant. My Sire bass, for example, cost me around $400, and as I said earlier, I love the way it sounds. Honestly, I don't think I would trade it for any other bass because I just love this one. So that's my clarification. Cheap stuff can sound brilliant and expensive stuff can sound like crap. It's all slightly dependent on individual taste for sure, but there's also an element of objective good or bad sound that depends on the construction. And in this case, the Fender guitar sounds objectively much better than the Ibanez. It's not even close. Important to note that this particular Fender is an FSR, aka Fender's limited edition guitars, which comes with custom shop Fat 60s pickups installed. So these aren't the regular Vintera pickups that Fender uses generally, and these pickups happen to sound particularly good. I've had a few expensive Strats, including the Sur and the Prestige Ibanez AZ, and this one is the best sounding one of the bunch by far, and it's much cheaper. So again, price doesn't necessarily equate to sound quality, but on the other hand, if the pickups suck, like in the case of the Ibanez, it's gonna be very difficult to get great tones. So the Ibanez is a really great guitar for its price, and you can get really good tones out of it, but you sort of have to work for them much harder than in the case of the Fender. I feel like I need to EQ the tracks I record with the Ibanez to much more detail than with the Fender, where I barely EQ anything and get great results. And I think that has to do with how well the pickups perform. There's a lot of nasty frequencies in the Ibanez that require a lot of EQing, and even then, the sound isn't totally smooth. While with the Fender, the sound is great from the start. The Fender is a bit sharp on the bridge pickup, but I think that's a curse of most Strats, really. So all in all, a more expensive guitar will most likely get you a better sound out of the box. You can always get a cheaper guitar and upgrade the pickups later, sure, but with the more expensive alternative, you also get the benefit of a better build and better materials. However, sometimes there's cheap guitars that simply work for us, and there's no amount of expensive materials and upgrades that can replace that. For example, this Ibanez is one of the most stable and light guitars I've ever owned. It's so stable that I changed strings to tune down to drop A and then changed to E standard again, and the guitar never really suffered any stability problems. It's also really light, which for me is super important. So this is the case of a guitar I might upgrade in the future, because it's not easy to find something this light and stable, even if I look in more expensive price brackets. I've owned some stuff throughout the years, and guitars that are both light and stable are pretty rare. So how much should you spend on a guitar? It depends on multiple things. Is this your first guitar? Spend $300. At that price point, you get everything you need for your first years, or even a guitar that you like so much you'll keep it long term. And if you already have a cheaper guitar and you're thinking of upgrading, then there's a few things to consider. Do you like what you already have? If you do, then I would insist you don't sell your cheaper instrument and instead save money for a more expensive one if you want the experience of a better built instrument. In this case, I would tell you to buy something different. If your cheaper guitar is a single coil guitar, get something with humbuckers, for example. Having different guitar types at your disposal is always good. If you don't like what you have, however, I would sell it and get something else. And in this situation, it might be tricky to find the right guitar if you don't know what you like yet. It took me well over a decade to finally start figuring out what types of guitars, brands, specs and features I like and which I don't. So if you're still figuring out your own taste and preferences, maybe get something less expensive first and then go from there. For the price of a $1,000 guitar, you can get 2 or 3 great $300 guitars and get a lot of variety, with the benefit that you can use those less expensive guitars to figure out what you like. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe, it would help me a lot, and let me know in the comments. Do you think expensive guitars are always better, or do you lean more towards cheaper stuff? Anyway, thanks for watching, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.